Well, hey everybody, Paul Warburg here in Utah, and I have a fun question for you today. What do you call a newly built Russian battleship? That's right, a submarine. Well, today I'm wearing one of my new favorite shirts because we're talking about the Russian arms industry. And specifically, we're talking about the Russian arms industry in relation to Russia's naval power, which, for all intents and purposes, as you may know, has ceased to be a relevant force in the modern world. Now, this is a more important topic than most people realize, because having a functional navy is perhaps the most important factor in whether or not a nation can project global power. It's been this way for most of human history, and it's been especially true in the modern age. Any country that doesn't have a navy can still exert regional power, but their significance as a global force, their ability to manipulate other nations across the sea from them, drastically gets reduced if they don't have an effective navy. Russia, of course, is intimately familiar with this fact. In fact, at several points in their history, Russia has lost their naval fleet just prior to major events that eroded Russian power and led to major changes in the stability of the country. A large reason that the United States owns Alaska is due to the failures of the Russian Navy in the Black Sea during the Crimean War. And the large reason for the fall of the Russian Empire has to do with the Japanese crushing the Russian Navy around the time of World War I, leading up to the Bolshevik Revolution. So Russia, and especially Vladimir Putin, who claims to be the greatest historian of Russian history, must be getting very nervous when they consider the lessons of the past and what they might mean for Russia's future, especially if you take seriously the prophecy of Russia's own leaders, which was made by Dmitry Medvedev in 2009 when he said that without a navy, Russia does not have a future. So let's back up a step and talk about what's going on with Russia's navy, which starts, predictably, with Russia's war against Ukraine, but then unravels from there to impact all four of Russia's major naval spheres. The story starts in the Black Sea, where one of Russia's main naval fleets has, for all intents and purposes, been annihilated and made irrelevant by a country that does not even possess its own navy. Russia assumed that because Ukraine did not have a navy, that they would be able to have complete control over the Black Sea during the entirety of their invasion. But what Russia didn't count on was the fact that Ukraine had become the master of asymmetric naval warfare, using things like anti-ship missiles, naval drones, or even small patrol boats to eliminate Russian naval vessels that oftentimes cost 10,000 to 100,000 times more than the cost of what Ukraine is using to destroy them. The result has been that Russia has lost over a third of its Black Sea fleet and over 40% of its naval tonnage in the Black Sea. But more than that, because Ukraine has been so successful, Russia has had to relocate ships from combat zones in the Black Sea to safety a lot closer to Russia, for all intents and purposes making that fleet largely irrelevant for this conflict. And the question you have to ask is, if this is the case with a country that is merely using asymmetric warfare, how could Russia fare against a country that could use both asymmetric and traditional warfare? Now, that's the part of the story that most people are familiar with, and most people who follow the war have heard about 100 times by now. But what a lot of people are unaware of is that Russia is also suffering in all three of its other major naval theaters as well, as a result of the war in Ukraine. Let's start with Russia's fleets in the Baltic and the Arctic due to the accession of Finland and Sweden into NATO, which were events that were triggered as a direct result of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Now, a lot of people know that the Baltic Fleet has, by a lot of people, long been considered Russia's most strategically important fleet, because the Baltic Fleet protects Russia's primary population centers from the body of water that is most vulnerable to Russia's, or at least what Russia perceives as their biggest geopolitical opponents. Now, Russia has two main positions in the Baltic. One is in the big port city of St. Petersburg, and the other is in the Russian exclave of Kaliningrad, which borders Poland and Lithuania. And these two ports have long been seen as two sort of pincers that Russia could use if they ever wanted to invade and recapture the Baltic states, by quickly coming in from both sides and overwhelming the naval power there and creating blockades. However, this Russian strategy depended on one main fact, or maybe two main facts, depending on how you look at it, which was the fact that the other major powers in the region, Finland and Sweden, were neutral and were not going to intervene in a war if Russia was involved. Sweden in particular has a very strategic position in the middle of the Baltic called Gotland Island, which is seen as an unsinkable aircraft carrier where missions could be run to basically control the Baltic Sea for all intents and purposes. So now that these two countries are part of NATO and would intervene if Russia ever tried to do anything meaningful with its Baltic Fleet, the Baltic Fleet is basically irrelevant because of Sweden and Finland, and also because if the Baltic Fleet tried to leave the Baltic Sea, it would have to do so by going through a very narrow choke point between Sweden and Denmark, which would put it well within range of not only naval vessels, but also the kinds of things that destroyed the Black Sea Fleet. So there's two regions that Russia's naval power is basically irrelevant. But what about the other two, the Arctic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean? Now, in this case, the situation is a little bit more complicated, but still very bad for Russia. One thing that needs to be understood is that of all of Russia's naval fleets, the Black Sea Fleet and the Baltic Fleet are the most critical to actually defending Russian territory. The other two fleets, the fleet in the Arctic Ocean, which goes down into the Atlantic as well, and the fleet in the Pacific Ocean, are more about projecting global power and nuclear deterrence, the kinds of things that go into growing an empire. If Russia had to pick between its fleets, it is most likely that Russia would choose to keep its Black Sea Fleet and its Baltic Fleet strong and capable, because those are the most important for actual national defense. And so when we look at the war in Ukraine and how much of these fleets have been made irrelevant, how much investment needs to go into improving capabilities for these fleets, we see a really worrying position for Russia's naval power as a whole. You see, naval power is unique compared to all other types of power, in the sense that no matter how much money and no matter how many resources you have, there is always a hard limit to which you can invest in and grow your navy. Naval ships take an inordinate amount of time and expertise to complete. It's not a process that can be done quickly, no matter how many resources you have, because different steps have to be completed before other steps can be started. And not only that, there are only so many dry docks where naval work can take place because of the physical limitations of a naval ship. It needs to go in a port of a certain depth. It is too big and large to be transported efficiently over land, and that means that there is a hard limit to which you can repair or grow your navy. Which is why one of the best ways to win a war is to erode your enemy's naval capabilities over time, because everything else can be replaced. Naval capabilities cannot be quickly replaced. Now consider all of this with the fact that Russia does not have unlimited money or unlimited resources. And they will need to rebuild their Black Sea Fleet and upgrade their Baltic Fleet while also rebuilding and repairing most of the rest of their military. What this means is that Russia is going to have to spend most of their capability, if not all or more than their capability, just getting back to where they were 4 years ago. All of these resources being bogged down during what is probably the most significant period of technological advancement in recent history, Russia is almost certain to fall behind in critical capabilities in its other major fleets due to a lack of investment. This might all be best demonstrated by a recent Russian stunt where they sent a submarine to Cuba, which when it surfaced was found to be missing major panels. Something that shows that even though Russian submarines are not being directly impacted by the war in Ukraine because they're not strategically relevant there, they are being indirectly affected because of limited budgets and limited resources. I forgot to mention, so I'll also throw this in, but Russia historically has gotten a lot of their major technological components for their nuclear submarines and their navy from nations like the United States or the UK. And obviously moving forward, these nations are not going to really be willing to provide Russia with these components. And that means that Russia not only has to develop the technologies needed for tomorrow, but they also have to play catch up by finding new ways to develop technologies that were available to them yesterday and no longer are. Now, there's just a couple more factors really quick that just put the nail in the coffin in Russia's navy that not a lot of people are talking about. Starting in the Arctic Ocean and going back to the accession of Finland and Sweden to NATO, this really hurts Russia's Arctic fleet, though maybe not directly. Basically what it means is that Norway, who's also a NATO nation, can now focus more of their efforts on building up a naval deterrence to Russia without having to worry so much about being weak in other areas. They can focus their military budget because they are right next door to Sweden and Finland, who would be able to quickly assist if Norway needed them to. And so that is going to likely block Russia's access out of the Arctic Ocean through the GI-UK gap and going to definitely limit Russia's capabilities there. And the final factor goes to Russia's main base of operations for its Pacific fleet, which is Vladivostok, which, if you read the news, and I created a video about this about a week ago, China is now working to do things that are going to make Russia's position potentially weaker there in the long term. Essentially, China is being somewhat aggressive in this area. They are asking Russia to cede land to them that will allow them access to the ocean at this point through Russia ceding China a river. And what this means is that Russia's final remaining fleet, which is primarily focused on nuclear deterrence against the United States, is going to have to pull double duty to have more resources focused on protecting from potential future Chinese aggression. This isn't something that Russia has worried about very much in very recent history, but it might be something they have to worry a lot about over the next several decades. There you have it. Russia is slowly or quickly becoming irrelevant as a naval power, and that is eroding their ability as a nation to be a global influencer. This shirt has never been more relevant, and if you like to get a good laugh, I will put a link in the description where you can pick one of these shirts up for yourself if you'd like to. That's all for today. See you guys on the next one.